Ruthless Billionaire returned from America and caught his fiancée humiliating his shy maid. His reaction stunned all. "Mommy, why is that lady so angry?" Luna Brooks tugged at her mother's apron with tiny fingers, her wide brown eyes blinking up at the scene unfolding in the grand foyer of Whitmore Manor. At 3 years old, she didn't understand words like humiliation or cruelty or power. But she understood her mother's trembling hands. She understood the way Angela Brooks had stopped breathing for just a moment when Vanessa Hale's voice cut through the marble hallway like a whip. "Because, baby," Angela whispered, kneeling briefly to squeeze Luna's little hand, her voice barely holding itself together. "Some people just have bad days."
It wasn't a bad day. It was something far worse than that.
Angela had worked at Whitmore Manor for 3 years. 3 years of polishing floors that never seemed to stay clean enough, of ironing shirts that needed to be wrinkle-free at 5 in the morning, of smiling quietly through moments that would have broken a less determined woman. She was 26, soft-spoken, and had a laugh that, on the rare occasions it surfaced, could light up a room. Most of the staff adored her. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Clarence, had once told her privately, "You're the best thing that ever happened to this house, Angela. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." But Vanessa Hale had been trying to do exactly that for 6 months, ever since Marcus Whitmore had placed a diamond ring on her finger and introduced her as the future lady of the house. Vanessa was the kind of beautiful that photographs well and deceives easily. Tall, polished, dressed today in a cream silk blouse and tailored slacks, she stood in the center of the foyer with the confidence of someone who had never once doubted her right to take up space. Around her, 8 members of the household staff had frozen in various positions, James the butler standing stiffly near the staircase, 2 kitchen maids gripping each other's sleeves, the groundskeeper who had stepped inside only for a moment and now clearly regretted it. It had started over a vase. A crystal vase, part of the Whitmore collection, had been moved from its position on the hall console table to the windowsill in the sitting room. Angela had moved it while cleaning. The afternoon sun through the east window had been striking it at an angle that was creating a blinding glare on the portrait behind it. She'd meant to move it back. She'd been called away to tend to Luna, who had scraped her knee in the garden. It had slipped her mind for exactly 47 minutes. 47 minutes was apparently enough time to ignite Vanessa Hale completely. "Do you understand the concept of instructions?" Vanessa's voice filled the foyer, each word sharp and deliberate. She was holding the vase now, turning it slowly in her hands as she looked at Angela with an expression of theatrical disbelief. "Or is that too complex? Should I draw you a picture? Should I write it in crayon so you can understand?" Angela stood very still. Her cheeks had gone warm. Her throat had tightened in the way it always did when she was trying not to cry, trying not to give whoever was hurting her the satisfaction of her tears. Luna pressed herself against her mother's leg, and Angela instinctively placed a hand on her daughter's small back, a quiet shield, a quiet comfort. "Miss Hale," Angela said, her voice low and measured. "I apologize. I moved it to prevent the glare from damaging the portrait. I was going to return it. I'm sorry I forgot. Sorry." Vanessa let out a short, incredulous laugh, glancing around at the staff as though inviting them to share in her amazement.
"She's sorry."
"Well, that fixes everything, doesn't it? 3 years this woman has worked here, and she still can't manage to follow basic instructions. She can't keep a vase in the right place." And yet, her voice dropped into something more cutting, more personal. "We keep her on. Out of charity, I assume. Because Lord knows what else she brings to this house besides chaos and that child running around underfoot." The word charity landed like a slap. Angela's hand tightened almost imperceptibly against Luna's back. The little girl had gone quiet now, sensing something her 3-year-old vocabulary had no words for. Her big eyes moved between her mother's face and the tall, angry lady, and she pressed closer, her small arms wrapping around Angela's knee. James the butler looked at the floor. The kitchen maids looked at each other. Nobody spoke. That was the thing about power used as a weapon. It silenced everyone in the room, not just the target. It made witnesses feel complicit just by standing there, made them ashamed of their own stillness even as they couldn't bring themselves to break it. Vanessa wasn't finished. She set the vase back down on the console table with deliberate care, then turned fully to face Angela, crossing her arms. When Marcus and I are married, things are going to change significantly around here. Starting with a review of every member of the staff. Every member. And those who can't demonstrate basic competence, basic respect for this house, will find themselves looking for employment elsewhere. She paused, letting that settle. Do you understand what I'm saying to you, Angela? It wasn't really a question. Angela understood perfectly. She had understood for 6 months. She understood every loaded glance, every unnecessarily critical comment, every small act of power that Vanessa deployed whenever Marcus was traveling. She understood that she was being told, in the most sophisticated and cruel way possible, that she was not wanted here, that she was disposable, that the 3 years she had given to this house, the early mornings, the long nights, the pride she took in her work, none of it mattered in the face of Vanessa Hale's preference that she simply not exist here. She opened her mouth to respond. She didn't know what she was going to say, but she refused to say nothing. And then the front door opened. The sound was so ordinary. A door opening. A click of a handle, a sweep of cool autumn air moving through the foyer, the soft sound of expensive leather shoes on marble. It was the most ordinary sound in the world. But every single person in that foyer went rigid. Because standing in the doorway, his carry-on bag still in his hand, his dark eyes sweeping the room in one long, quiet, devastatingly observant gaze, was Marcus Whitmore. He had come home early. He stood there for exactly 3 seconds that felt, to everyone in that room, like 3 hours, taking in the scene. The staff frozen like statues. Vanessa's crossed arms and lifted chin. Angela's flushed face and carefully controlled expression. And Luna, pressed against her mother's leg, looking up at the tall man in the doorway with the open, unfiltered curiosity of a child who didn't yet know to be afraid of powerful people. Marcus's eyes moved from Vanessa to Angela, then down to Luna, then back to Vanessa. His expression didn't change. Not exactly. But something shifted behind his eyes, something dark and quiet and very, very still, and James the butler, who had known Marcus Whitmore for 11 years, recognized it immediately. He'd only seen it twice before. He took a small, involuntary step backward. Because James knew, the same way you know when a storm is about to break, not from the rain but from the particular quality of the silence before it, that what happened in the next few moments was going to change everything in this house. Everything. Nobody who met Marcus Whitmore for the first time ever forgot it. It wasn't his height, though he was tall, 6'2", broad-shouldered in a way that his perfectly tailored suits couldn't quite conceal. It wasn't his face, though it was striking in a severe, angular way, the kind of face that photographers loved and rivals feared. It was something harder to name than any of that. Something in the quality of his attention, the way he looked at a room and seemed to understand every dynamic in it within seconds, the way he never spoke before he'd fully processed what he was seeing, the way he made people feel simultaneously seen and braced. Marcus Whitmore, at 38, was the kind of man who had been forged rather than simply raised. He had grown up in this very house, actually, though it had looked different then, quieter and emptier, with fewer staff and a great deal more silence. His father, Edward Whitmore, had built the original Whitmore fortune in commercial real estate, and Marcus had watched him do it from a careful distance, absorbing everything. But it was what Marcus had watched his father do outside of business that had shaped him most profoundly. The coldness, the dismissiveness, the particular talent Edward Whitmore had possessed for making the people around him feel small. Servants spoken to as though they were furniture. Employees discarded without ceremony. His own wife, Marcus's mother Catherine, slowly diminished over 20 years until she was barely a shadow in her own home. Catherine Whitmore had died when Marcus was 19. The official cause was pneumonia. Marcus had always privately believed the real cause was something closer to erasure. He had built his own empire, tech acquisitions, strategic investments, 3 successful startups before he was 30, with his father's discipline and his mother's ghost always present, a contradiction living in his chest that he had never quite resolved. He was ruthless in boardrooms, yes. Demanding of performance, yes. He did not tolerate waste or carelessness or dishonesty in professional contexts, and his reputation for decisive, sometimes brutal business decisions was entirely earned. But there was another side to Marcus Whitmore that very few people had ever seen. Mrs. Clarence had seen it 11 years ago, when he'd personally arranged and paid for her daughter's surgery without ever mentioning it to anyone. James had seen it in the quiet Christmas bonuses that arrived without ceremony, in the way Marcus knew every staff member's name and something meaningful about each of them, in the way he'd once spent 40 minutes in the kitchen talking to the cook about her ailing husband. Angela had seen glimpses of it, in the way he always said good morning when he passed her in the hallway, in the way he'd once stopped during a phone call to help her lift a heavy box without being asked, setting it down where she needed it, and walking away without making anything of it. Those who worked for Marcus Whitmore tended to be fiercely loyal. Those who worked against him tended to regret it. He had been in New York for 10 days, finalizing an acquisition that had required his physical presence at 3 consecutive late-night negotiations. He was exhausted in the particular boneless way that comes from too many red-eye flights and too many conference rooms with recycled air. He had been planning to change his clothes, eat something, sleep for 11 hours. He had not been planning to come home to this. He set his bag down slowly, just inside the door. He didn't close it behind him. The cool air was still moving through the foyer, and somehow nobody moved to shut it. He looked at the room again, more slowly this time. He catalogued what he saw with the same precision he brought to a financial statement. Vanessa, standing in the posture of someone who had been mid-performance and had been interrupted, arms still crossed, chin still slightly elevated, but with a new uncertainty flickering beneath the surface of her composure. The staff, frozen in the elaborate stillness of people who desperately wanted to be somewhere else. The vase on the console table slightly off-center, as though it had just been replaced. And Angela Brooks, who had worked in his home for 3 years and who he had privately always thought was more composed than anyone gave her credit for. Angela, whose face was flushed, whose eyes were glassy with the particular brightness of tears being actively refused, whose hands were clasped in front of her in a posture that he recognized as the posture of someone absorbing something they shouldn't have to absorb. And beside her, looking up at him with enormous brown eyes and a tiny furrow of concern between her small brows, Luna, 3 years old, her little hand wrapped around 2 of her mother's fingers. Marcus had known about Luna. Angela had been a single mother when she was hired. It had all been in her file, and he'd made the call himself to ensure the estate had appropriate accommodations so that Angela's daughter could be with her during the day when childcare wasn't available. It had been a practical decision, he'd told himself at the time. Good staff were hard to find. He looked at the little girl for a moment longer than he'd meant to. Then he looked at Vanessa. Marcus. Vanessa's voice had changed, softer now. The sharp edges quickly smoothed over, replaced by a bright and slightly breathless welcome. She uncrossed her arms, began to move toward him. You're home early. Why didn't you call? I would have had dinner prepared. I would have. What's happening here? His voice was very quiet. That was the thing people never understood about Marcus Whitmore. They expected volume from a man of his intensity. They braced for shouting. What they got instead was something quieter and, in its own way, far more unnerving. A voice that was almost gentle, with absolute iron underneath it. Vanessa blinked. She was good at pivoting. It was one of the things that had initially attracted him, that social agility. It's nothing, darling. A minor household matter. I was just having a word with Angela about. A word. Yes, just a small. Angela. Marcus turned away from Vanessa, and the gesture, so deliberate, so complete, silenced her mid-sentence. He looked at Angela directly, and his expression had shifted into something that was harder to read now, something complicated and careful. Are you all right? The question, asked that plainly, that directly, in front of everyone, it did something unexpected to Angela's carefully maintained composure. For just a moment, her face crumpled at the edges. She steadied it almost immediately, but that moment had been seen. Yes, Mr. Whitmore, she said quietly. I'm fine, thank you. He held her gaze for a beat longer. Then he turned back to the room, and when he spoke again, every word was deliberate, shaped with the kind of precision that meant he had decided something and would not be undecided. Everyone, he said, please give us a moment. The staff moved. They didn't walk. They almost evaporated. So complete was their relief to be released from that frozen foyer. James disappeared toward the east wing. The kitchen maids retreated. The groundskeeper practically fled. In seconds, the foyer held only 3 people: Marcus, Vanessa,
Angela.
and one small girl, looking between all of them with bright, watchful eyes, still holding her mother's hand. Vanessa recovered quickly. That had always been one of her gifts. She turned the full warmth of her smile toward Marcus, letting her shoulders drop from their defensive posture, letting her voice slip into something softer and more intimate. The register she used when she wanted to remind him that they were together, that whatever was happening, they were on the same side of it. Marcus, sweetheart. She reached out and touched his arm. You've just gotten home. You're exhausted. You don't have the full picture of what was happening here. Then give it to me. Not a request. She recognized the difference. She laughed lightly, a sound she'd practiced until it was perfect, airy, unconcerned, the laugh of someone who found this all just slightly absurd. It's genuinely nothing. The vase was moved, the Whitmore crystal, the one from your grandfather's collection, and I was simply reminding Angela of the importance of care with the family pieces. That's all. I'm going to be the lady of this house, Marcus. It's my responsibility to maintain standards. By speaking to my staff the way you were speaking when I walked in. It wasn't a question, and the word my, the quiet, firm my, sent a small current through the room. Vanessa's smile held, but her eyes changed slightly. I was firm, yes. Sometimes that's necessary. Angela. Marcus turned again, away from Vanessa, and something in the way he kept redirecting his attention, always back to Angela, away from Vanessa, had begun to communicate something to all of them, a message being sent through action rather than words. He looked at Angela with that same direct, careful gaze. I'd like to hear what happened. In your own words. Angela's lips parted. She glanced once at Vanessa, whose expression had hardened beneath the smile, and then back to Marcus. The old instinct rose immediately. Minimize it, smooth it over, say it was nothing, make it easy for everyone. 3 years of making things easy for everyone. But Luna chose that moment to look up at her mother, and to say, in her perfectly clear 3-year-old voice, Mommy was sad, mister. The room went very still. Luna blinked up at Marcus with the total unself-consciousness of someone who had not yet learned that honesty in difficult moments is considered dangerous. The pretty lady made Mommy sad, she added, with the calm authority of someone presenting established facts. I saw. Marcus looked at Luna for a long moment. Something moved through his face, something that wasn't quite any of the standard emotions, or was perhaps several of them occurring simultaneously. He crouched down, slowly, until he was at Luna's eye level, resting his forearms on his knees. What's your name? He asked. His voice was different at this register, quieter, softer at the edges. Luna considered him with a serious appraisal of a child deciding whether an adult is trustworthy. Luna, she said finally. Luna Catherine Brooks. Angela watched Marcus go very still at the middle name. He hadn't known it. She'd never had reason to share it. But Catherine, his mother's name, landing in this moment, from this small, earnest face, seemed to move through him like something physical. Luna, he repeated. That's a beautiful name. Luna nodded, accepting this as simply true. Then she looked at him more carefully. Are you going to make the pretty lady stop being mean to my mommy? Marcus held the little girl's gaze. Yes, he said quietly. I am. He stood. He turned to face Vanessa fully, and what Angela saw on his face in that moment, and what she would think about later, in the quiet of her small room, turning it over carefully, was not anger, exactly. It was something older and more certain than anger. It was recognition. It was the expression of a man who had been shown something he had perhaps been trying not to see for a long time, and who had finally, irrevocably, seen it. Marcus. Vanessa began. Vanessa. His voice was level and completely quiet. I heard you.
From the hallway.
I heard everything you said. The silence that followed was absolute. Vanessa's face changed. The social confidence, the practiced composure, it didn't exactly crumble because she was too skilled for that, but it shifted, recalibrated, flickering through several calculations in the space of a second as she assessed what everything meant and how much of it he'd actually caught. You don't understand the full context. You told her she was kept on out of charity. Each word precise and separate. You implied her daughter is a disruption. You threatened her employment. You spoke to her in front of the entire household staff. He paused. That's the context, Vanessa. I was managing the household. You were humiliating someone who works for me. The quietness of it was devastating. Someone who has given 3 years of excellent service to this estate. Someone who has never once given me cause for complaint. He glanced briefly at Angela just for a moment. Someone who deserves considerably more respect than what I walked in to find her being shown. Vanessa stared at him, and Angela watched something she had never expected to see. Vanessa Hale, perfectly composed Vanessa Hale, slowly losing the thread of her certainty. Because she had miscalculated. She had believed, as people like her often do, that absence meant permission, that the behavior she displayed when Marcus was away existed in a separate category from the Marcus who would return. She had believed she understood what he valued, what he'd overlook, what mattered and what didn't. She was realizing, in real time, that she had been profoundly wrong about all of it. I have been managing your household for 6 months. Vanessa's voice had changed register again, lower now, less performance, more something rawer and more real underneath. She was fighting now, genuinely fighting, and there was something almost more unsettling about this version of her. I have worked to understand this house, to understand you, to prepare to be the partner you need. By making a maid feel worthless in front of her colleagues. Marcus said it quietly, not an interruption exactly, but a rerouting. By threatening someone's livelihood. By speaking about her daughter as if Luna were a problem to be solved rather than a child living in this home. He stopped. Is that the kind of partner you believe I need? Vanessa pressed her lips together. I believe, she said carefully, that you are jet-lagged and that you walked in at a poor moment and that you are reacting without all the information. Vanessa. Something in the way he said her name, not loudly, not harshly, but with a finality that was almost kind in its directness, cut through everything she was building. We're going to talk, he said, properly, later tonight, but first. He turned away from her, completely, finally, with the full deliberateness of a man who has made a decision and is now enacting it, and he looked at Angela. Angela, who had been standing through all of this with her spine straight and her hands clasped and her chin held at exactly the angle that said, I am here. I am not invisible. I will not be made invisible. Angela, who had spent 3 years being quiet and capable and overlooked, whose name had been turned into a lesson today in front of people she worked alongside, whose daughter had looked up at a stranger and told him plainly. The pretty lady made Mommy sad. Marcus crossed the foyer toward her. Not quickly, measured steps, the same deliberate quality to all his movements. He stopped at a respectful distance, and he looked at her directly, and when he spoke, his voice was different from anything she'd heard from him before. Still quiet, but the iron was gone from it. What was underneath? It was something else. "Angela," he said, "I want to apologize to you." The words landed in the silent foyer like stones dropped into still water, sending ripples outward in every direction. Angela blinked. "Mr. Whitmore, you don't need to." "I do." Firm but gentle. "What happened today happened in my home. That makes it, in part, my responsibility. You should never have been put in that position. Not today, and not any day before today, if there have been others." He paused, and she could see him carefully not asking have there been others, because he already knew the answer, had perhaps already accepted what it meant that he hadn't known sooner. "You are a valued member of this household, Angela. Your work is excellent. Your character is evident to anyone paying attention, and your presence here, yours and Luna's, is not charity. It is, and has always been, completely deserved." Angela's jaw was tight with the effort of not crying. She nodded once, precisely. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," she managed. He nodded back. Then he looked down at Luna, who had been following all of this with the focused attention of a child watching a very important thing happen, and who had now come to some kind of internal conclusion about Marcus Whitmore, because she stepped forward from behind her mother's leg and looked up at him with her arms slightly open at her sides, the universal small child posture of "I have decided you are acceptable." "You're nice," Luna announced. A sound escaped Marcus, brief, involuntary, almost startled. It was a laugh. A real one. Small and short and not performed at all, the kind of sound that comes out when something catches you completely off guard. "Thank you, Luna," he said seriously. Luna appeared to consider this, then nodded with great satisfaction. And then, because she was 3, and 3-year-olds operate on their own timeline, she pointed at Vanessa across the foyer and said, in a voice of perfect matter-of-fact clarity, "That lady should say sorry to my mommy." The silence that followed was arguably the most profound one yet. James, who had not actually left but had been standing around the corner of the east hallway listening to everything with the still focus of a man who had devoted his life to this house, pressed his hand over his mouth. Vanessa stood very still. Marcus looked at his fiancée across the foyer. He said nothing. He didn't have to. Luna had said it. And across the room, in the kitchen corridor, 2 maids stood pressed against the wall, and one of them was crying quietly, and the other was squeezing her hand, and both of them were thinking the same thing. Everything is different now. Everything just changed. The evening settled over Whitmore Manor with a peculiar quiet. Vanessa had retreated upstairs without speaking further, climbing the staircase with her hand on the railing and her chin at the particular angle of someone holding themselves together through sheer force of will. Marcus had watched her go without moving to follow her. He would speak with her tonight, as he'd said. But not yet. Not while his thoughts were still finding their shape. Mrs. Clarence had appeared from somewhere. She always appeared at necessary moments. It was one of her gifts, and had gently guided Angela and Luna toward the kitchen, murmuring something about tea and biscuits that Luna responded to with immediate enthusiasm. Angela had gone, glancing back once at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read and didn't try to. She needed space and time, and he respected that. He stood alone in the foyer for a while, looking at nothing in particular. James eventually materialized beside him with a glass of water, as he always did when Marcus had been traveling, because James had noticed years ago that Marcus forgot to hydrate on long flights and had simply made it his quiet practice to address this without comment. "Thank you, James," Marcus said. "Of course, sir." A pause. Then James, who was 61 and had worked in this house since Marcus was 27, and who had survived Edward Whitmore and 3 market crashes and 2 attempted hostile takeovers that had very nearly destroyed the Whitmore estate entirely, said, quietly, looking straight ahead, "If I may, sir, what happened today in this foyer? It needed to happen." Marcus looked at him. James kept his gaze forward, perfectly composed, perfectly discreet. "Some things needed to be seen," he said simply. "And you saw them." Marcus said nothing for a moment. Then, how long, James? James considered this with care. Miss Hales settled into her authority here quite quickly, sir. Within the first month.
He paused.
There were adjustments made to accommodate her preferences. Adjustments? The word was doing a great deal of work. Why didn't anyone tell me? James turned to look at him then, and there was no reproach in his expression. James was not a man of reproach, but there was something honest in it. I believe, sir, that people were uncertain of what to say, and uncertain of how it would be received. Marcus absorbed that. The particular loneliness of power lived in that answer, the way it created silence around itself, the way people managed what they shared with you based on who they believed you wanted to be. He had thought he was knowable to the people in this house. He wondered now how much of that had been assumption. In the kitchen, he could hear Luna's voice, animated, fully recovered from the day, apparently describing something to Mrs. Clarence with great urgency. Given the rising pitch and the small hands, he could imagine moving to illustrate whatever point was being made. And Mrs. Clarence's laugh, real and warm, answering her. And beneath that, softer, he could hear Angela. She was humming. Very quietly, probably not even consciously. Just a low, tuneless thread of sound, the way people do when they're doing something automatic, rinsing a mug or folding something, and their body is releasing tension through the only outlet that doesn't require a decision. It was the kind of sound that meant I'm all right. I'm still here. I made it through. Marcus stood in the hallway and listened to it for a moment longer than was probably appropriate. Then he walked upstairs to have the hardest conversation of his recent life. Vanessa was sitting in the chair by the window in the private sitting room that adjoined the master suite. She'd changed into something softer, a silk robe, her hair down, and without the armor of her performance, she looked younger and more uncertain, which he hadn't expected. She looked at him when he came in with an expression that he recognized with a pang. She was frightened. For the first time in all their months together, she looked frightened. He sat across from her. He didn't begin with accusations. He thought of his mother. He thought of the way erasure happened gradually, the way it required silence and complicity, the way it built itself out of all the moments when no one intervened. I want to understand, he said, what happened. Not as a prosecution. I want to understand. What came out of Vanessa over the next hour surprised him. Not the rationalizations. He'd expected those. But beneath the rationalizations was something more complicated. A woman who had grown up in a household with enormous staff and very firm hierarchies, who had been raised to believe that the efficient management of domestic help required distance, required authority, required drawing lines that did not blur, who had understood managing a household to mean something that turned, in practice, into control, who had been playing a role she'd been taught without ever examining whether the role itself was what she wanted to be. None of this excused what she'd done to Angela. He was clear about that, and he said it plainly. But it explained something. And explanation, even when it doesn't excuse, has its own value. I don't know if I can be what you need, Vanessa said finally, quietly. It was the most honest thing she'd said in their entire conversation, possibly in their entire relationship. I don't know if I know how to be in this house the way you want me to be in it. Marcus sat with that for a long time. I think, he said finally, that we have both been unclear with each other about what we actually are, about what this is. She looked at him. He looked at her. And in the space between them, something settled, not with drama, not with the sharp scene that the earlier part of the day had produced, but with a quiet, honest deflation of two people acknowledging, gently, a truth they'd both been circling. The ring on her finger was returned before the night was over. Neither of them cried. They were both too tired for tears, too wrung out by honesty. She left that night, and Marcus sat alone in the sitting room for a while after the car pulled away, not particularly sad, which he would examine later, that lack of particular sadness, and understand it as information. Outside, the autumn wind moved through the estate. Somewhere in the staff quarters, a light was on. 3 weeks passed. The manor settled into itself differently, quieter in some ways, lighter in others. The particular tension that had lived in the hallways and the kitchen and the side rooms where staff gathered, that braced and watchful tension, slowly exhaled. People moved through the house more freely. There was more laughter from the kitchen. Mrs. Clarence, never particularly subdued to begin with, seemed to have expanded somehow, filling space she'd been carefully not filling for 6 months. Angela noticed all of it. She was good at noticing things. She noticed that James stood a little straighter. She noticed that the 2 young kitchen maids, Priya and Eloise, had started eating their lunch in the garden instead of hunched over the small table in the back corridor. She noticed that the groundskeeper, old Harold, had taken to leaving small wildflower arrangements on the kitchen windowsill once a week for no particular reason, just because he apparently felt like it now. She noticed that Marcus Whitmore had changed something in the way he moved through his own house. He'd always been present. She'd never known him to be one of those employers who existed as a remote abstraction, known only through instructions passed via intermediary. But now there was a quality to his presence that was different. He stopped in doorways. He lingered in conversations that he would previously have ended efficiently. He asked questions, not the directing, purposeful questions of a man managing outcomes, but something more like the questions of someone who is genuinely curious about the answers. He asked Angela, one morning in the upstairs hallway, whether Luna's scraped knee from 3 weeks ago had healed. She'd stared at him for a moment, genuinely startled.
Yes.
Yes, sir, it's completely healed. Thank you for asking. He nodded, looking briefly pleased by this information. Good. He paused. She told Mrs. Clarence that she'd been attacked by the garden. Angela laughed, a real one, sudden and unguarded, the kind that surprised her. She did. She's very committed to that version of events. Something in Marcus's expression shifted at the sound of her laugh. It was subtle, a softening, a slight warming, and it was gone almost immediately, replaced by his usual composed regard. But she'd seen it. She was good at noticing things. I wanted to ask you something, he said, and his voice had taken on that particular careful quality she'd come to recognize as Marcus Whitmore preparing to say something he'd thought through carefully. I've been considering establishing a household welfare policy, formal guidelines for how staff are to be treated, clear channels for concerns to be raised. I'd like to consult with the staff in developing it. He paused. I'd like to consult with you specifically, if you're willing. You've been here longest among the daily staff. You'd have the most comprehensive perspective. Angela looked at him. You're asking my input. I'm asking your input. She was quiet for a moment, processing this, arranging around it a new understanding of what was being offered, not just the specific thing, but the larger thing underneath it. The recognition. The acknowledgement that she had a perspective worth seeking. The deliberate, formal respect of being consulted rather than simply managed. I'd be glad to help, she said. Over the following weeks, the policy was developed through exactly the kind of thoughtful consultation Marcus had described. It wasn't grand or dramatic. It was specific and practical and shaped by the actual experiences of the people who worked in the house, things that had been endured quietly and could now, finally, be named and addressed. Angela contributed more than anyone, precisely because she'd observed more than anyone, and because her contribution was welcomed with genuine attention each time. Luna, meanwhile, had taken a particular shine to the house's owner. This had developed gradually, and was primarily, Angela suspected, because Marcus had at some point been cornered by her daughter in the downstairs library and been presented with a drawing Luna had made, and had looked at it with what Luna apparently found to be gratifying seriousness, asking detailed questions about what he was looking at. Luna had explained that it was a horse and also a dragon, and also his house, and Marcus had examined each element carefully and said it was the finest rendition of all 3 subjects he'd ever seen. Luna had then decided he was one of her favorite people. After that, whenever Luna encountered Marcus in the course of moving through the house, which happened with increasing frequency once Luna became aware that encounters with him were a possibility, She would greet him with the full, unguarded enthusiasm of a child who has bestowed her approval and sees no reason to be subtle about it. She showed him things, found him in rooms to share observations with him. At one point delivered him a snail she'd found in the garden, cupped in both tiny hands, for his inspection and appreciation. Marcus inspected and appreciated the snail with complete sincerity. Angela had come around the corner to witness this, her small daughter holding a snail up to the most powerful man she'd ever personally encountered, and that man leaning forward in his chair to look at it with genuine engaged interest, and had stood there for a moment, one hand over her mouth, feeling something happening in her chest that she didn't immediately have a name for. "Mommy." Luna had spotted her. "Come look. He thinks it's good too." Marcus had looked up then, and caught Angela's expression before she'd had time to fully neutralize it. That caught, soft, undone look, and something moved between them across the room. Brief and real and unnamed. He smiled. A full one, the kind that reached his eyes. She smiled back. And Luna, standing between them with her snail, looked from one to the other and then giggled. That bright, particular giggle of a child who doesn't fully understand what she's looking at but understands that it's good, that the people she loves most are happy, that the room she's standing in is warm. It was such a small moment. A Tuesday afternoon. A snail in a library. But Angela would think of it later. Much later, when the full story of her life in this house had written itself in directions she hadn't imagined on any of the difficult days, as the moment she understood that what had happened 3 weeks ago in the foyer, as terrible as it had been a door. Not a closing. An opening. A man who had spent his life learning the wrong lessons about power had come home at the right moment and chosen, under pressure, with a whole staff watching, to use whatever he had in the most human direction available. He had seen a woman being made small and had refused to look away, had refused to let it stand, had stood in front of everyone and said, "This matters. She matters." That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. Luna set the snail carefully on the windowsill, patted it gently, and declared it would live there now and be their pet. Marcus said this seemed reasonable. Angela said they would revisit that decision. Luna said Mommy was being difficult again. Marcus looked at Angela with his eyes bright and warm and said absolutely nothing, which was somehow the most eloquent response possible. Outside the windows of Whitmore Manor, the autumn had given way to the first tentative suggestions of winter. The trees had let their leaves go. The sky was the particular clear gray-white of cold approaching. But inside the library in the yellow lamplight, there was warmth. There was a woman who had been seen. A man learning how to see. A little girl who had looked into the face of the unknown and declared it good. And somewhere on the windowsill, a small snail moved slowly through the light. It was, Angela decided, a very good Tuesday. Some storms don't destroy what they touch. Some storms clear the air so completely that what's left afterward is cleaner and truer and more real than anything that existed before. Marcus Whitmore came home looking for rest. He found, instead, the beginning of everything that would actually matter. And Luna Catherine Brooks, 3 years old, fearless, perfectly clear about what was right and what wasn't, had shown him exactly where to look.